All right, if I share my screen now.
Yes, Nandini. Can you share?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
So I hope you're able to see the screen fine. Ruchi, can you confirm? Yeah? Okay, great. Thanks. So firstly, thank you again so much for having me here. I'm really excited to be here. And thanks, Patrick, for a great session. And honestly, that question answer session also with you and Ruchi was really helpful. I think a lot of stuff that's going to come up in my presentation will overlap. So thank you so much for having me here, and let's get started. So my name is Nandini, and I work as a program manager for technology for wildlife. And today, I'd just like to introduce you to technology for wildlife and the approach that we take to using drones in conservation. And we look at the value that drones add to conservation and why we use them. After that, we look at the important considerations for the appropriate use of drones in this field, and followed by potential use cases. And then I'd just like to show you a couple of case studies of our projects, and then we'll open up for questions. So at Technology for Wildlife, our mission is to amplify conservation impact, and we do so through the appropriate use of modern technology. So we collaborate with partners implementing programs on the ground, and we find people who have aligned outcomes as us, and then we ensure that the implementation is as effective as possible. So the skills that we use are spatial analysis and robot operations, and the robots include aerial robots or drones, which I'll talk to you about today. And we also use underwater robots or ROVs for our fieldwork when needed. So why should we use drones for conservation?
Is it me or is it Nandini?
No, I can't hear her either, unfortunately. She might have dropped off on the audio.
I guess so. I should ask her. Nandini, you're back. You can continue.
Okay. Is everything visible now? Is that fine? Is working fine? Am I audible and is the screen visible? Yes. Okay. Okay. Hopefully this time around, I'll just quickly rush through this so I don't want to take up more of your time, but I've already introduced myself and Technology for Wildlife and the program. And I wanted to talk about the use cases of drones in conservation. So one of the ways that we use it is in extremely difficult field conditions. So in a place where it might be dangerous to do field work or might be extremely physically strenuous, such as places of very high altitude. We also use drones for conservation where previously these field sites were inaccessible. So an example of this can be narrow streams where boat surveys are not possible and you're trying to get overhead images of, say, dolphins. So those kind of areas become newly accessible with the use of drones. The other use is just making data collection more efficient. And sometimes, especially with congregation events for wildlife, it happens in very concentrated time periods and requires a lot of human resources. So in this case, sometimes it makes data collection just more efficient and effective to use drones to reduce some of the manpower and make it more effective. And this is really valuable in conservation because resources are limited. So anything that you're able to save gets redirected to more conservation effort. And finally, to get really high resolution data of the habitats, which was not always previously possible. So sub-centimeter level details that might be important to understanding the ecology and behavior of species and then planning conservation projects. That all becomes possible with the use of drones in conservation. So that's why we use them in our work. But we do want to emphasize that while drones can be very useful, doesn't mean that they are always useful. Like all techniques, they can't be universally applied. So in fact, many times in our work, our, our job is to tell people that maybe using drones for a certain project would not be needed and would not be the most effective use of their resources. For example, some cases drones can't capture the required data. And for example, very densely, heavily canopied areas or dense forests. Sometimes it also happens that people want to map very, very large areas, and there's now very good satellite data that's available for this. So again, it might not be needed. And in some cases, honestly, just using phone cameras with GPS locations enabled is sufficient, and it's not necessary to bring in a drone. So the reason I'm saying all of these examples is just because we're very conscious of the fact that we don't want to use this technology as a gimmick. We don't want to misuse any of it. And so we only use it when it fits completely right with the conservation outcome of the work. So given a certain case, if we decide that yes, drones are the most appropriate technology and this will enhance the conservation output, then how you use it is very, very important. So in the next few slides, I'll quickly talk about what I mean about the considerations of using drones. So the first is the biological consideration, since this is about wildlife conservation. And when we're operating in an ecologically sensitive area, we have to be aware of the species and ideally work with biologists so that they understand their behaviors best. So that will help determine like at what distance to fly, at what time to fly, so as to minimize or avoid any disturbance. And if it's not conducted with the utmost sensitivity, it could like not only defeat the purpose of habitat mapping, but cause more damage. As this example that you can see was a drone crash or near a nesting site of elegant terns earlier this year in California. And this resulted in the terns abandoning their nesting site, which is only one of the 4 known nesting sites of these birds. So any project that we design has to understand the ecology and landscape of the place first. And knowing the potential impacts is not always so easy and straightforward. Of course, no one wants to cause damage. Especially, it's difficult because a lot of times drones are being used for the first time with certain species. But it's really important to put in the effort and background work with biologists that know that place and species best so that you can minimize that risk. The second is something which you also just spoke about before the session started, which is the ethical and social component. So one has to be really sensitive of the impact one might have on the people, both in terms of just the physical presence of the drone in their area, as well as the data that's being collected. So it's really important to try and be as transparent and inclusive as possible to protect everyone's rights in this area. And even if we think of it purely from the conservation output perspective, it's happened at times that projects have not adequately considered the like concerns and needs of the local communities while taking on projects, and people have felt so anxious around the use of drones that has made them not only hesitant around the use of drones, but also of wildlife conservation. So that completely defeats the output. And again, with this, there are so many grassroots organizations working, and there are resources, as Ruchi was mentioning, which can be used for incorporating communities as part of the program. A lot of time we found that they have very valuable input and can better design, like help you design the program, tell you exactly where to fly. So this is a really important consideration before we start flying. And then, of course, are the technical and environmental conditions. So choosing the right drone based on the area. Are you looking for long distances? Then you might need a fixed wing drone, or if you're trying to traverse a complicated canopy and you want object detection, and maybe you want to use a smaller drone that's better availability. Another consideration of environmental conditions might be, say, wind conditions, the amount of light and reflectance. Then would you need a lens on your filter, a filter on your drone lens, or would you have to change how fast you're flying the drone based on the wind speed, so that you get the right resolution, especially if you're making maps, the right amount of overlap. And then finally, like, what are the needs of the actual project? Because the flight plan will completely depend on that. The height that you fly will depend on it. The pattern that you fly will depend on it. So all of these things are just an overview of the different kinds of considerations that go into play before you decide to actually fly the drone. And these are some of the use cases that we use drones in our work for. So assessing populations of wildlife, mapping and modeling their habitat. Both of these can be used for better understanding and planning projects for conservation, as well as ecological studies of behavior, because drones allow much more high resolution in at that real time behavior of one spot of species moving. It allows for more detailed studies sometimes that were not possible at high level, and definitely not through satellite data. And similarly with high resolution documentation, as I was mentioning, of really small scale that allows you to like understand the topography of beaches, of changes in floodplains. And definitely not the least is communication of this. Sometimes it's not possible to see cumulative impact through ground photos, and having that to show visually what's happening is, we found, like, very useful for advocacy and showing impact. So I just want to show quickly, I'll talk about two case studies of our work. So one of them is documenting turtle nesting beaches. This is something that we did in Goa in March of this year. So the conservation goal of this project was to collect data for research as well as communication, planning, policy, and advocacy. And we needed this to create very high resolution maps of the topography of the beach, a 3D model, look for pollution along the habitat, as well as collect compelling imagery for communication. And finally, we wanted to conduct test transects for future population surveys. So I'll talk a little bit about all of these. So the project was being done for the conservation of olive ridley turtles. Olive ridley sea turtles are classified as vulnerable in the IUCN Red List, primarily because the adult population is declining. So some estimates indicate that the number of baby hatchlings that survive to adulthood can be as low as 1 in 1,000, but the less optimistic estimates indicate that survival rates will be as less as 1 in 10,000. So when females, and one important thing about their life cycle is that females return to the same beach on which they're born to lay their eggs. So these nesting sites remain largely static, and they're really important to understand and conserve these sites, because that's where they congregate each year, and it's important for the continuation of the species. So human activities around this can disturb or harm this nesting activities and the turtles. And this was the reason behind this mapping exercise. So this is a high resolution map that we created with our flight on Moji Beach in Goa. And it can be zoomed in to have a resolution of less than a centimeter per pixel. And it's not actually one image, it's close to 600 images that have been stitched together. So making this map involved flying the drone in a grid, east to west and north to south, and taking in at set intervals and consistency with the right overlap. And then as each drone image has its own GPS tag, and it was all stitched together and processed to create something like this. So it's important to know, especially if the beach topography is changing, if new projects are coming, you know exactly what it was at one point and what one might need to restore. This is an example of a picture taken of the same beach for communication. So you can see how different it can look and for different purposes. So here you have a better view of the shacks on the beach and the beach beds to understand the context. And sometimes we think of wild habitats as very removed from human activities, which is not true. So this is just trying to explain the kind of coexistence or the kind of pressures that take place in the same place. And finally, we conducted test surveys for population surveys. So the population surveys are done for adult for olive ridley turtles that come to shore to nest. And such a survey is typically done using boats. And when the Aribada happens, when the mass congregation happens, because such a large number of turtles come in a very short period of time, it requires a lot of human resources suddenly to be pulled into this area. So we want to be we want to hopefully we'll be using this in the coming couple of weeks actually, to be doing like already adult female population assessments of the shore of Orissa. And this was just a test pattern of understanding the flight height to get the resolution, how much overlap we'll need. And this was based on studies conducted in other places in the world, where it was shown that one can successfully detect the turtles, and it reduced, it made it more effective, like it made it more accurate and lower cost. This is something that we hope to do. The last case study is that we were using drones to study high altitude lakes in Ladakh. And our objective was to explore some of these lakes because this is an example of extreme environment and high altitude and cold environments, which are not very well documented, and also to look for plastic in these environments. Why is it so important to look for plastic here is because these lakes are endorheic, which means that they have no outflow. So any plastic that comes into these lakes remains here and breaks into microplastic unless it's physically taken out. And because it's not possible to take boats or swim in these lakes because it's so cold and the pressure is volatile, it wasn't previously known what the pollution situation was there. So this was one of the ways that we were using drones. So flying overhead over the lake was actually the only way I think that we could have possibly detected plastic, as you can see in the image here. These are high resolution maps of sections of the wetlands of the lakes, which we shared with scientists for conservation research. So with collection of data in the same habitat, we tried to cover as many objectives as possible. So the third one of those was collaborating with researchers that work on pikas and marmots, which are wild rodents that live in high altitude plateaus. And researchers that study these animals talk about how labor intensive and difficult the field work can be. So, and doing it every single year, even though it's important, is not generally feasible and sustainable. So we're trying to collaborate with them to see if we can use drones to map their burrows. So if we look closely, you can see that actually the burrows have different sizes. So according to the different species, you can distinguish between whether it's a marmot or a pika burrow. And finally, we took images also for communication and exploration of the landscape. Many of these lakes have very limited access to the public, and some of them were documented using drones for the first time. And we're trying to use this media to advocate for their preservation and conservation as best as we can. So this was everything that I wanted to say, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts and questions. And thank you so much.
We are up for the Q&A session. If you have any comments, questions, please put it in the chat. Meanwhile, ma'am, there's a question. So, like drone is a foreign object for like the biodiversity. So, introducing a foreign object to them, how does it affect them?
How does it? Sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
As drone is a foreign object for the biodiversity, so introducing drones for conservation projects where there is a huge population of some particular species, how does it affect them?
Okay, so as I was mentioning earlier, so we generally only try to use drones in a situation where we think that it would affect the species less than the current method that's being used. Something because already scientists use different methods for assessing populations because it's the only way to understand what is going on and then what needs to be done for conservation. But we only take situations that would like reduce that effect. So, for example, if you look at dolphins or turtles, if you're going into the water, like in river dolphins, for example, if you're in a boat survey near the dolphin, those dolphins, Gangetic river dolphins, for example, are almost blind. So they're working on acoustics. So a boat in their environment is quite stressful. So in that case, using a drone, which is flying above the water, actually reduces the interference in their habitat. So we find the situations ideally that could use that will reduce any negative impact or stress that we might be putting on species. And in some cases, beyond that, again, we have some amazing scientists all across the world that have studied these species so closely. So they have a sense of, say, their how well they hear, at till what distance, how far they see, what kind of their temperament is, whether they are very nervous or whether they're quite hardy. And that also we use for initially testing and then modifying flights. So now there are, say, broad parameters that people have developed around species of, say, like for this species, you have to fly at a minimum distance height of up 30 meters over their level so that the noise doesn't affect them. Of course, some of that has happened with trial, but the ideal is to start with minimal possible impact and then create that standard and go by it. It's not like already present for each species, but working with biologists that know them well is the best way to do it. And we always follow protocol of, if it seems like this animal is, or not even the animal you're trying to study, but any animal around it is getting stressed, then you immediately modify the flight to distance yourself. And if that is also still stressing them out, then you just stop the flight, because the end goal is conservation. So if you're working if your flight is making them nervous, then that is doing the opposite purpose. Does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the answer. So there's another question coming up in the chat. What are the use cases where multiple drones are required?
Okay. So I think one of the use cases might be this turtle nesting, where there's turtles that are nesting on the beach as well as coming in by shore, especially if it's a large stretch of land, if it's time sensitive, which something like the Aribada is, where a lot of, like, hundreds and thousands of the same animal are coming at the same time. So you want to make sure you're not missing anything, trying to get maximum overlap in that case. So I think those kind of congregation events are useful. And another area where I'm trying to think is if you're trying to do like a high resolution understanding of a particular landscape. So, for example, if there's a nesting site of gharial and it's on a sandbar, and you are trying to see whether or on one side where the flow is affecting them, or if there's a barrage on the other side, you're trying to get a detailed understanding of one event, then having multiple drones capturing the whole area might be helpful again.
There's another follow-up question. What is the range of numbers of drones in such scenarios?
So, to be honest, we haven't had to use multiple drones yet for a project at the same time. We might have to during the congregation event, but I think we'll be starting from a conservative approach. And I don't think at this point there's a project that we know of which will require more than 2 drones. And I don't think as of now anything is being done at a scale where you would need to have a fleet.
Thank you, ma'am, for your answer. There's another question. Like, people generally have been using drones where competent authority has been their national competence authorities, so like DGCA in India, like FINE, US, and similarly. But let's say they are working on a wildlife scenario. So what should be their competent authority that they should keep in mind?
Okay, so I think that's a great question, actually. So, I mean, the first thing is, of course, Forest Department of India. So they are also like the official caretakers of all the natural heritage of the country. But beyond that, I think it's really important to involve both uh, conservationists like foundations, but also social organizations, because there's very few places in India where it's completely uninhabited. So even if it's a wildlife area, even in tiger protected areas, there are always people. So I think beyond the technical regulations, it's important to consider those local contexts and understanding that both from the ecologist and the social perspective is important. So I would rather than giving one organization, I would say based on the area, find the most local and reliable source of both of those. So find scientists that are studying that ecology of that area and find grassroots organizations that have a real connect with the people there. And those would be the best people to collaborate with to design a project there.
Thank you, ma'am, for your answer. So another question is, like you shared a use case where you had to use your drones in Ladakh. So Ladakh is used to having a very difficult terrain and a very extreme environment where it is extreme cold, and you generally have like because of the altitude you have very less air density. So what difficulties did you face in using drones there?
So actually for us also this was an experiment because sorry, because we didn't have much information on how our drone would react at that altitude. So for us also, we were trying to see how far it would go. Like the normal range of our drone is say 8 kilometers, which I mean anyway during line of sight, although in these areas it's somewhat possible, but we that was definitely affected. Like both the battery life of the drone as well as the range that it was going without losing connectivity was affected by the altitude. So technically, those were the two main challenges to the drone. The rest of it was for us to just carry enough equipment to the sites and then find places where we could charge the batteries with reliable power so that nothing gets ruined. Those were the very like real logistical issues. But yeah, technically it was the battery life and the range.
Thank you, ma'am, for the answer. Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question. See, what work is being done, here is quite interesting. Is the work of the presenter focused on drones for wildlife, but across multiple projects across the country, or is it a specific project where drones are being used and for wildlife conservation, and thereby she is involved in it? Is it
Sure.
focused?
No, so I'm sorry again if I wasn't clear and if some of this was lost earlier. But the organization I work for is called Technology for Wildlife. So our aim is very much to use modern technology for the conservation of wildlife and the environment and forests in India. And we do it across species and landscapes. So we use drones, both aerial and submersible, across the country, wherever we find the most effective use and impactful use of the technology.
So you work with wildlife, organizations, wildlife conservation organizations, and partner with them, and then bring in the technology aspect.
Exactly. We're also of conservation background, so sometimes we conceptualize projects ourselves and find collaborative partners. But most of the time, as you're saying, there are already people implementing projects on the ground, and they need some of the technical input, and that's where we collaborate with them, both in terms of drones as well as spatial analysis.
So maybe there is also a place for you to evangelize the work you're doing to college campuses where people are students are contemplating their careers, where they can look at technology for conservation, wildlife conservation as a possible area, and then be able to also gain the requisite skill sets to be prepared to get into a job like this.
Sure, that's a great idea. We've luckily had some chances to interact with college students, and some of the ways we're right now working with them is With IISc, there's a lab that works on drone development, and for the most part, for conservation, drones don't exist for the purpose of conservation. We just use and modify the market. So that lab helps modify drones and create things for the purpose of conservation and different objectives, and that's one of them. So that's one way we've been able to collaborate with students. And another recently was we were working with PES University in Bangalore, and there we had a set of students who were looking at analyzing drone and satellite data for detecting mangroves through computer vision, so that they can detect changes, see if there's been any loss in mangrove and where work has to happen. So it's a really great to work with students, but you're completely right, and that it would be great to meet more students and bring more innovation.
Yeah, so I did chemistry, botany, zoology in my bachelor's, and the kinds of careers we could contemplate if we were interested in conservation is typically wildlife conservation organizations. But with the new age and these technologies being available, you are being able to evangelize to multiple campuses will also give you, I mean, it's like a feedback loop, because college campuses also teach you some things about theoretical aspects, and then you'll be able to put that into your job. Great chance for you to start those conversations a bit more widely.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Nandini.